nice to be with you in Colorado. Can you hear in the back? Sounds good. All right, great. And welcome to everybody on the web. The church has decided today to live stream. So we have a number of people joining us live on the web today as well. So thanks for putting that on to the church members. I know that was a big undertaking, so thank you for that. As you heard, our topic for today is the healing power of stillness. And the fact that it snowed all night last night in Colorado just seems perfect, because when I think of a snowfall, I just think about how still it can get in the morning when the snow has kind of blanketed the earth and how beautiful it looks. So I'm sure you all are ready for some flowers, but anyway, I was loving the snowfall. It is, after all, March 30th or something. So anyway, as we start off today talking about stillness, I'm just going to share with you some advice about listening that I was given when I was a graduate student, as you heard. I studied development issues, international development. I also studied peace building. And one weekend I was going off to hear a talk, and my professor of peace building gave me some advice. He said, people go to talks and they take notes on what the speaker is saying. And he said, that's great, but what I want you to do is pay attention at the same time to what your own heart is saying and take notes on that. And that's my advice for you all today too, is that as you are listening to me share from my heart, my own stories, if you hear your own heart speaking, I hope you hear your own heart speaking, and that's the real message that you came for today. So pay attention to whatever that message is for you, as I'm sharing from my own heart. Thank you. Great. The healing power of stillness. So practicing stillness has been sort of a key element of my healing work over the past, 6 years since I've been giving this talk, I guess. And that I'll just share with you all that has kind of been the thread through the last 6 years. And it speaks to the fact that stillness is not about changing our outside environment. It's really about what happens in our own thinking, in our own thought, in our own consciousness. So it starts there, it starts within, it doesn't start without. It doesn't, even if the snowfall is quiet and beautiful, or whatever the quiet place we might look for to go to find stillness in our lives, the stillness we're really seeking is one that's in our consciousness. And that when we find that and we sort of tune into it, that it changes the way we experience what happens outside of us. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, starting there. And this story to me illustrates the fact that it doesn't matter how chaotic it is in our lives. It doesn't matter how many things we have to do or what demands are happening on us, but that whatever's going on outside, can we bring stillness to whatever we have to do on any given day? And how do we do that? So this story happened in Sarajevo in 1992. It's a true story. And on this given day, a man walks into the center square of Sarajevo, and he sits down in a plastic chair, and he's dressed from head to toe in formal concert dress. He's the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra. And he sits down, he takes out his cello, and he starts to play. And if you can imagine just the sounds of a beautiful cello playing in the square. But behind him, the war is going on. There's artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are running for cover because it's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. And this man doesn't just sit in the middle of the war on this one day and play his cello and then go home, but he comes back for 22 consecutive days into the middle of the conflict and sits there playing his cello to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that were killed at the start of the war in a bread line, while standing in a bread line. And when I heard this story, what struck me about it, I think, was just the fact that he was sacrificing his own safety, potentially, to bring a little bit of peace, of music to the community around him. He didn't know how to broker a ceasefire between the warring factions of his city, his beloved city of Sarajevo. All he knew what to bring was his music. And so he brought that. It really makes me think. Now, I hope none of us in this room or listening online are ever in a situation like that where we are in the middle of a war zone. But on any given day, things can bombard our thinking. They can bombard our lives in one way or another. And so can we go in the midst of that bombardment, whatever that looks like, and have that same inner calm, that same deep settled stillness that allows us to go fearlessly, that allows us to bring whatever we have uniquely to bring to that situation. And that to me is where stillness begins. Now, there's a woman named Pam Brown who wrote something about stillness that sort of sets a tone as well. She said this. Someone sent this to me a couple years ago. At the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here in this stillness is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing that we fear can damage its perfection. This kind of stillness is something that all of you in this room and on the web already have. It's a state of being that we have within us that we often forget about in the rush of daily life. In all the things that we have to do, all the planning and the doing and the activity and the taking care of children or taking care of family members or doing church work or doing our jobs or driving in traffic or whatever it is that we have going on any given day. Or maybe we have a life that really feels like we're lacking a sense of purpose, and maybe we're spinning our wheels, or we want more activity in our lives and we don't feel that vibrant purpose and connection that we're looking for. But whatever it is that would try to bombard us, that would try to drag us down and forget, there's within our own identity, our own being, is this sense of stillness that cannot disappear no matter what has happened to us in our lives. No matter what tumult, no matter what does she say, that no shadow that can dim that light within each of us. And that to me is fundamental to the practice of healing in Christian Science. Everything that you hear today comes from my lifetime as a student of Christian Science and also as a practitioner of the science and working with other people on healing. And fundamental to that idea is that often what we're looking for outside of ourselves, we only can find within. And it's the same for stillness. We have a little music theme. Are there any musicians here today? Any? Excellent. Okay. Oh, a whole few. Colorado is a very musical place. Okay. Wonderful. So my daughter plays violin, and she's been playing for many years, and my son actually is a cellist. And so I've spent umpteen number of hours in music lessons with my kids. And the first thing, do you know the first thing you have to do when you arrive at a music lesson for a violin? Anybody? Yeah, you have to tune it, right? So the first thing you do is tune the instrument. And one day I was sitting in the lesson, and the teacher puts on the tuner, which is the pure, perfect tone. And then my daughter starts to play the same note on her violin, and of course it's out of sync, and it just has, that it has this vibration that you can hear that it's out of sync with the tone. And then slowly she starts to turn the little fine tuning knobs on the violin until the instrument lines up perfectly with that pure, perfect tone. And in that moment, I closed my eyes and I couldn't hear two things in the room. It sounded like there was just one thing happening. Not a tuner over here and a violin over there, but just oneness. And that to me is what stillness does, is it shows us the oneness that we have with God, with divine love. It feels like that sense of oneness, like there's no separation between us and divinity. Sometimes we're tempted, I think, to think about God as this faraway being, somewhere. Maybe it's a power, maybe it looks like a guy, maybe it looks like a woman, who knows? But we sort of pray to this thing far away, hoping it will come and intervene in our lives. But for me, stillness is not just quieting our thoughts and getting still, but it's really about tuning in to that we always have with God, that we are at one with that divine being. There's no separation. And in that moment, a lot of times, for me at least, the things that we're worried about, our anxieties, the challenges we might be facing, whatever it is that's going on in our lives, in that moment, they fall away for that sense of being at one with God, with divine love. God in Christian Science is a power. It's a power of universal, impartial love that everybody can tap into. Even if you don't believe in God, you call it something else, but it's a power that everyone has access to, of divine goodness. And our talk today is actually based on two ideas, one from the Bible. Christian Science is based on the Bible, and another book I'll show you in a minute. And this little tiny idea is in Psalms 46. And Psalms 46 is a really turbulent psalm. So David's writing about it, and he talks about how the rivers are troubled and the mountains are shaken over there, and they were like falling, crumbling onto Denver or Fort Collins. Anyway, so this is what's happening in the psalm. The whole world is kind of in turbulence. And then near the end of the psalm is this little directive that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Now, there's two things there, right? What's the first one we're being told to do? Be still, right? And the second one is know something, right? So Mary Baker Eddy, in her book, so the founder of Christian Science is a woman named Mary Baker Eddy. She wrote this book, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. And she talks, Christian Science is really, Christianity, you all may understand in the sense of that it follows the Bible and the teachings of Christ Jesus. The science part says that the authority for practicing Christianity doesn't come from faith alone. That the authority for a science, like if you take science class, if you're in physics class, for example, you have the book learning and the theory, but then you also have labs, right? And if you're supposed to do a lab for homework, and my daughter's in science right now and has a lab every week. So, if she went into school one day and had not done her lab and said, well, I didn't really feel like doing it. I have faith that the principle of physics works. And so I didn't bother to do the lab. What's her teacher going to say? Right. Someone went like this, right in the back. Yeah. Like she's going to have to go do the lab. Really, he'll say, go back and do the lab. A science relies on putting it into testing it out, practicing it in life, so that that principle works, and then you learn more about the principle. That's like the science of Christianity. That the authority doesn't come in what one person says or someone else's experience. It doesn't just come from reading the Bible or the Science and Health book. The authority comes from living it out in life. And that's what Mary Baker Eddy wanted to teach us, that she learned that from Christ Jesus, that it's about living it in life, that's the authority of a science. It's not only on faith alone. And so her book really talks about how to do that, how to put into practice the ideas of the Bible. And she says this, she says, "Spirit God is heard when the senses are silent." It's on page 89 of her book. And so be still, quiet our senses, right? And then know something, know that I am God. And so those are the two pieces for me of what stillness is about. The first part is that it's talking about being, right? It doesn't necessarily even say, like, stop what you're doing or stand still. It just says be still. It's a being quality. And so often I think we get into this trap of feeling like we're human doings, like we're doing all the time. In fact, often, when here in America, at least, I don't know if I often get asked here in America is, what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? But what are some of the answers that you get? Anybody? A fireman, right? A teacher. What else? I wanted to be a librarian. That didn't happen. But anyway, so you're always talking about what you want to do. But the question is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I just read an article recently from somebody that said when they were a kid, They said, I want to be happy. The teacher said, no, that's the wrong answer. What do you want to be? I want to be happy. Yeah. But I think that's the right answer, right? But that's the being quality. And that's what the be still is about. It may mean, as Mary Baker Eddy says, that we quiet our senses. We stop, we pause what we're doing, that we find that moment of pausing in the midst of our activity, but it's a quality of being that we're looking for. There's a chapter in the Science and Health book called The Science of Being. And sometimes I have to remind myself it's not the science of doing a lot of stuff. It's really the science of being that we're looking at. And that's, to me, what spiritual practice is, or practicing stillness, is tuning in to God, which teaches us about our own divine being, which we are not, which going about our daily life, we're not necessarily going to find in our daily lives or in the world a lot of encouragement for focusing on a divine sense of being. It's really about getting still that connects us with that. Mary Baker Eddy also said something at one point to her students. She had an experience in her life where she was cured of something incurable. She went on to teach about healing and had students that she taught from the writings that she wrote. And at one point, her students were asking her how she healed, and she said, well, you need to keep your violin in tune, she said. And again, she didn't mean you have to play a violin, right? But but it's that sense of that if we keep ourselves in tune with God, we don't have to constantly tune up, right? That we keep ourselves in tune by retuning, by always focusing in on that oneness with God. And just like a violinist who is playing a concert, for example, they may tune their violin in the morning, but they don't just leave it there and then play all day long and hope it stays in tune. It won't stay. It absolutely doesn't stay in tune. Because as the violin gets played, it inevitably gets a little out of tune, or a little out of sync, you know. And so they have to constantly be listening, noticing when the instrument's out of tune and retuning it. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor for prayer and life and stillness. Is that for me, and it works for me, because even though I've been giving this talk now for almost 6 years, and I've been talking about stillness a lot, I have kids, I have a new puppy at home, which, is not a still thing really. And I live in Boston where the traffic is horrendous. And so there's so many things in all of our lives, I'm sure you all have the same thing, that try to pull us away from being still and try to make us feel agitated or anxious or worried or concerned about things. World events can do that. It can be something in our lives or our families. And so to me, the retuning throughout the day is about finding those moments of quiet, those moments of being, of stillness throughout our day. For me, it's not enough. I wake up at 4 a.m. every day. I started that when I had kids. I had to get up before my kids so I could have that quiet moment before I had to rush into motherhood. And it's a really beautiful, quiet couple of hours for me. But it's not often enough to just rely on that to kind of make it through the day, right? Because by the end of the day, if you've only spent that morning thinking about the quiet, I forget what was I thinking about in the morning, But what I've realized is it's those moments of quiet in the morning that have to kind of reoccur throughout the day. That's that kind of constantly keeping yourselves in tune. And for me, that means just pausing before I start the car to take my daughter to school, for example, or just taking a moment to really think about God and really be quiet before I rush into a meeting or another activity. That stillness is a constant practice of feeling that oneness and connection with God. Now, we're going to talk about it in 3 ways today. We're going to talk together about how do we think about being still for ourselves. We're then going to talk about how stillness for ourselves can keep us from living in constant reaction to other people and relationships. And then we'll talk finally about finding stillness so that when world events would try to agitate us or pull us down a road of feeling judgmental or critical or angry or agitated about the world, how can we maintain that stillness in light of world events? So we're going to do that in the next half hour or so. Okay. So the first one to think about, so being still for ourselves, practicing stillness for ourselves. To do this, I just want to get a vision with you all of what it looks like when you're really at peace with yourself. So think about that for a moment. There's a bunch of characteristics, and I'm going to ask you what it looks like for you. For me, one of the characteristics of being at peace with myself is that I stop judging others so much, and I stop judging myself so harshly. Another characteristic for me of being at peace with myself is that I just kind of smile more effortlessly. And sometimes I even say hello to people in the elevator in Boston, which nobody does, ever. Here in Colorado, people do, but in Boston, no one talks in elevators anyway. But it just kind of overflows, that joy kind of overflows when I'm truly at peace with myself. I'm not so concerned about what others think of, we're not concerned about what others think of us as much as we are about just living the light like that cellist in the square. What about for you though? For you, when you think about being at peace with yourself, what characterizes it for you? Anybody, just shout it out. What does it look like for you?
You're living the present, not planning the future.
Say it again.
Living the present, not planning the future.
Thank you. So being really at peace grounds us in the present moment, in the now, right? We're not sort of ruminating over the past and kind of going over it, over and over it. And we're also not worried about or anxious about the future. We're really able to appreciate and notice the present moment. Sometimes for me, it means when I, go to get a tea at a coffee shop or something, I actually look at the person in the eye, as I'm getting my tea, as opposed to just thinking about the next thing I'm doing, right? Sometimes that kind of, I remember, wait, right now I'm just talking to this one person rather than thinking about 10 minutes ahead, really being in that present moment. Good, someone else in the back had something. Oh. A sense of calm, right? That being at peace with ourselves gives us a sense of calm that I think is sort of undisturbable. It's a real sense of being calm, and being calm inside. It may mean that we're moving really fast. Have you all seen a spinning top, like, a spinning top? That when you spin it, if you do it perfectly, it looks like it's almost still, but it's moving really quickly. And to me, that's that kind of calm, that no matter how fast you're moving or not, at the core is that sense of calmness. Yeah, hope. Oh, a sense of hope. Thank you. That when you're at peace, you don't agree with hopelessness. That you have a sense of hope for the future. That's great. Someone else? Did you have something?
Notice more things.
You notice more things. Say more about that.
You're just more aware of, I guess, people around you, opportunities to bless someone, what you're doing, how you can do it better.
Absolutely. So she said there's an awareness of what's going on around you. You're feeling more connected, and you are aware of more things and how you can help, how you can be involved. So when you're really at peace, you're aware of and actually the thought is off of yourself. Because I'm taking it a little further from what you said, but when you're feeling at peace, you're not so concerned, you're not self-absorbed. You're able to be useful to the world. Excellent, great. Anything else? At least a couple more. Yes.
Even though the turmoil may crop up, the realization that turmoil is only temporary.
She said, even though the turmoil may crop up, there's a realization that turmoil is only temporary. And I think what's great about that is that being at peace with ourselves, it does not mean an absence of turmoil. It doesn't mean an absence of conflict outside of us. In fact, even if you study conflict transformation, conflict resolution, peace building, peace is not defined as only the absence of war. That may be a ceasefire may facilitate a peace process, but it doesn't bring peace. That peace is actually a living, vibrant thing that has to be, it's a presence of something. And it's not just an absence or a void. It's the same with stillness, that being still, for me, is not an emptiness. It's not just emptying ourselves out to be open to Freddie. It's quieting those thoughts. But then it's that knowing we talked about. It's that presence of divine love, the presence of God that's right there, guiding and giving us direction in our lives. Excellent. Good. Okay, anything else? What else it looks like? Yeah?
Knowing unopposable good.
Okay, knowing unopposable good, right? So often we get stuck in these dualities in life, good and evil, good and bad, positive, negative. And we think that life is just a mixture of these kind of dualities. But when we find that moment of peace and stillness, to me, it is a oneness and a goodness that's unopposable. That we're no longer stuck in the duality of good and evil, of positive and negative, that we feel a oneness and a power that doesn't have an opposite. That's all good. Great. Okay. Anyone else have a burning one? Yes.
Joy.
Joy. Thank you. That being at peace with ourselves allows us to feel joy of what might be a really sorrowful time. It means we can find that joy. That we're not waiting for something to change to find the joy. We're not waiting to get the check in the mail to be joyous. We're not waiting for the house to be clean or for my kids to finally do what I ask them, or to clean their rooms or whatever. That there's such a tendency of our human mind to say, well, when this happens, when this changes, then I'll feel this way. Then I'll find joy. Then I'll find peace. And that is so tempting. That we think about being at peace when something changes, when I get over my divorce, when I finally pay off my debts, when. And what stillness does is it says that we can find that joy before all those things change. Before anything changes outside of us, we can have that moment of joy and connection. One other thing I'll just add, and then I'm going to tell a story. Is that for me, when I feel really at peace, I'm willing to let things unfold rather than having to make them happen or control them. And this was really key for me about 10 or so years ago, maybe longer now, 15 years. When for a number of years, I'd had this reoccurring problem of waking up in the morning and being having a really stiff neck. And it would get sort of progressively, it would kind of come and go. And I grew up in a family where my mother was a Christian Scientist, and so she taught us from a young age to pray for healing for anything that came up in our lives. So I was used to doing that, and I'd found relief from lots of other challenges in my body and my life before this, and so that's what I had been doing. But I would find relief from the stiff neck, and I would go on with my life, but then it would come back, and it kept coming back, and kept coming back. And friends would say, well, maybe you need to change your pillow, or maybe you need a new bed, or, et cetera. But I wasn't actually looking for what was causing it or what might be the reason. I really wanted to understand more about that sense of being that we were talking about earlier and how that could bring permanent relief, that it wasn't about changing an outside circumstance, but really looking within. But I hadn't, so I'd kind of been doing that through prayer, but hadn't found a solution yet permanently. And finally, one day, it was before Christmas, and I was experiencing a lot of stress and pressure in my life. I had a huge workload. I had family coming into town for the holidays, and I had a standard. I wanted my house clean. I wanted to make the meal. I had presents to wrap. I had my kids. I wanted to create this whole holiday for everybody that was perfect, of course. And I think I had 12 chickens at the time that needed things, and a cat. Anyway, all these things going on. And so I woke up about 3 days before Christmas and had another stiff neck, and it was really bad this particular morning. I woke up and it was there. Who knows why? And my first thought was, oh no, this is not going to work. This can't happen. I have too many things on my to-do list. So as I do every morning, I started praying and really sort of having this conversation with God. But my conversation was a little bit like, okay, God, we need this to be healed right now because I have to go on with all the stuff I have to do. And so I joke that, it's kind of like I'm the CEO of my life, right? And God is like this divine assistant that you call on when you need help, and then just so you can keep going. I'm not recommending that. It didn't work anyway. But that's kind of how I started, because I was feeling the demands of my life. That's what I was feeling primarily. And when I started to feel this pain, I thought, no, this isn't going to happen. So I kind of prayed that way, and I looked up in the Bible, in the Science and Health book, and in the weekly Bible lesson that the Christian Science Church puts out, and I found some good ideas, but I went throughout my day and tried to get a lot done. I was pretty uncomfortable. Went to bed the next day, woke up the next day, and it was worse. And by the third day, I had never been in so much pain in my life. And I'd already had 2 kids, believe me, and that was not painful compared to this. And it was literally to the point of taking a step forward would send these shooting pains up my spine. And so I had to sit in a position totally still and try not to move so I would avoid the pain. So I was forced to completely stop everything I was doing. And my first feelings were kind of discouragement and frustration and annoyance that I was now not accomplishing anything, holiday ready, etc. But I knew I needed to put all those thoughts aside. And it took a while, I would say. It was a little bit of a battle going on in my head. But finally, I got some of those thoughts really quiet. And if you, some of you probably know this directive from Jesus. He talks about how to pray in the Bible. And he says, go into your closet. And then what's the next thing he says? Right, shut the door, close the door. So that's what I was trying to do, was kind of get that door closed on the thoughts that were racing in my head. And sometimes that can take a week, it can take a month just to get that door closed. But in this case, it took a couple hours. And when I got really quiet in my thinking, I just heard this little kind of still small voice, right? There's a story about Elijah in the Bible where he's fleeing from persecution from some things he did. And there's an earthquake and a wind and a fire. And then it says he heard God in the stillness after all that turbulence. And that's, once I kind of quieted down my thoughts, I heard this little voice in my head say, I am the shepherd. Now, I wasn't consciously thinking of shepherds or sheep or hadn't read anything about this. So I took it as sort of an inspiration, a divine inspiration. And I thought about it and I thought, well, if this is my relationship to God, God is the shepherd, then what does that make me? Right, the sheep. And then I realized I really didn't want to be a sheep. In fact, I was actually kind of biased against being a sheep. Because I grew up in Chicago, the Chicago area, and I remember one of my elementary school teachers saying, don't ever be a sheep. Right, what was she talking about though? Right, don't be a blind follower of your friends who are doing dumb things. That's what she was trying to teach. It's really good advice, that advice. But I think what happened is I grew up feeling, really in charge, feeling those qualities of leadership, feeling, like I was in control of things. And at this moment, I realized that's what had been so challenging for me, that I had felt like I was the one in charge, and now I'm struggling and I can't be in charge of this planning for the household and for the holidays. And gosh, if I'm not doing it, it's just not going to get done right. Right? Not a good thought, but that's what was kind of coming to me. And I started to realize, well, I just started to think about what it looked like to be a sheep once I got over my bias, briefly. And so I started thinking about the qualities of sheep. What are some of the qualities of sheep? Innocence, trust, yeah. What? Humility, thank you, yes. Humility, right? That you're not at the center of your life, yes, exactly. What else over here? A quietness. Oh, the sheep are quiet, aren't they? Yeah, they're peaceful, kind of peaceful animals, I think. Anything else about sheep? They follow. Is that what you all said over here too? Yeah, that they follow. They follow, and they don't really, they don't say, can I lead today? They just follow the shepherds. They're content in that following mode. Do you know also that sheep will only drink by still waters? So they're trusting the shepherd to find them the stillness that allows them to be nourished. And so I spent a good amount of time reading and thinking about these qualities of the sheep, that I realized I had been thinking of the qualities of the shepherd for myself, but not qualities of the sheep. And what I realized is that many of us that are in charge of things, I mean, if you think about anything you're in charge of in your life, whether it's children or a household or work projects, we're all in charge of stuff. But what I discovered as I was spending these hours sort of contemplating this concept was that the question, again, it's a question of being, of how are we being in charge? How are we shepherding these projects and shepherding our kids and shepherding our lives? Are we doing it with that qualities of the sheep? Or are we doing it with thinking we're the ones in charge and God is our second in charge, right? And this really was a major shift for me in realizing that God and spirituality and prayer is not something that I call upon when I'm in trouble to kind of slap into my life to help me go forward. Of practice, of stillness, of prayer is about connecting with that oneness that allows us to be the outcome of what God is doing. That we don't do anything of ourselves, like Jesus talked about, that we're the outcome of God's work. And so that's what allows us to be a sheep. And we may still be in charge of a lot of things, but we do it knowing how we're shepherded. And that just shifted my whole mindset. And I could feel at that moment just the stress, the pressure, the tension, the feeling of being in charge, the perfectionism, the feeling that it was all on my shoulders, and if I didn't do it, it wouldn't get done right. All of that just melted away. And the pain went with it. And it just transformed me into really wanting to be, well, I guess a sheep, right? In line with God as the shepherd. But it also changed my morning prayer, because my morning prayer had been a little bit like, good morning, God, here's all the things I have going on today. And it really shifted into a sense of, good morning, God, what do you have in store for today? And how can I be receptive to that? And that change not only allowed me to have relief from the pain that day, but the whole challenge that I'd been having for a couple of years went away. I haven't had an issue since with the whole stiff neck thing. I didn't change my bed or my pillow or any of those things. It was really that realization of just letting go of feeling in charge. And the healing aspect of it too for me was that in Christian Science healing, when we get really still and we connect with that feeling of oneness, it's like we're tuning in to a divine reality that's all around us that we just are missing sometimes in the rush of daily life. And when we are tuned into that divine reality, in those moments of quiet, we're not problem solving with prayer to get healing. And sometimes I think that's a temptation, at least in Christian Science practice sometimes, to think, well, here's my problem, God, give me some good ideas so I can find a solution. But that's not actually the prayer that Christian Science teaches. That prayer is actually not at all a problem-solving method. It's really about putting aside the problem and focusing on that vision we talked about what it looks like to be at peace with ourselves first, or whatever idea we might need at that moment. And when we focus on the vision of what we're looking for, a vision of what does it mean to be healthy? What does it mean to be still? What does it mean to be at peace? What does it mean to be a good friend, et cetera, et cetera? What does it mean to be a child of God? That those ideas shift and transform our consciousness, and that's what solves the problem. Not by focusing on the problem and trying to find good ideas. I'll just add in an idea from Mary Baker Eddy, and then we'll move on to the second part. But Mary Baker Eddy said that to the burdened and weary, Jesus saith, come unto me. There remaineth a rest for the righteous, a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep settled calm. That underneath our lives, like underneath all that turbulence, is where we find that deep settled calm. It's already there. We don't have to create it. We don't get it from a certain religion or a certain course of study or from being a certain age. It's just a matter of quieting the senses and tuning into it, which isn't as easy as it sounds, but it really is as simple as that, even if it's not as easy as that. All right, so we have to move on because I promised I'd only stay here for an hour. So the second part is about looking at stillness and peace in relationship to others. And I'll just share a brief story. So I have two younger sisters, and one of my younger sisters doesn't have any kids. And when I was a new mom, one of the things that became a regular pattern between us was that she would come over and of her own goodwill would notice what I was doing with my son and would give me advice about how I should do it differently. Yeah. And I would think to myself, well, you don't have kids, how do you know? I didn't always say that, but it became kind of a point of contention for us. And we got into this pattern of that wasn't really very comfortable. And this went on for some time. And at the same time, I had been thinking about this idea of the Christ. Like we just heard that in that what Mary Baker Eddy says about the Christ. And I had been thinking about, well, what is the Christ and what does it mean? It's not Jesus himself. It's the spirit that Jesus embodied that was timeless before Jesus. It continues today. It looks like many different things. And I was trying to figure out how to really live that Christ in my life. That was my major preoccupation at the time. And I decided to apply it to my relationship with my sister. And what occurred to me is how often Jesus paused before he rushed into something. Before he goes and heals Bartimaeus, he's in Jericho, and everybody's shouting, and the disciples are yelling at the Bartimaeus to be quiet, and he's yelling for Jesus' attention, and everyone's shouting, and there's all this noise around. And Jesus, it says, stood still. And I kept thinking when I read this story a couple of years ago, why didn't he just run up to Bartimaeus and heal him like that? Because everybody would have quieted down. And it doesn't say why, but there's numerous times in the Bible where people stand still. Prophets will just be still before they go and do whatever they have to do. And so this kind of got me. And I started thinking about the Christ as being the activity of divine goodness that occurs in that pause. That it's not about figuring it out with our own little mind, but it's about pausing to let that Christ idea be there. So I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I don't know how it's going to work, but I'll try that with my sister. So she came over the next time and we were talking, and I did something with my son, and I could see that, she was getting ready to give me advice about how I should do it differently. And I could feel, if you've ever been in conflict with someone, you can feel your whole body kind of tensing up, like getting ready to fight, like defending yourself, like, okay, this is my argument this time. How can I convince them this time, right? Kind of arming up. And I felt that, but then I stopped. And I thought, no, I'm not going to defend myself or argue with her. I'm just going to pause and sort of listen for that Christ idea. And an idea immediately came to me. I don't remember what it was, sorry, but I just said it, like some idea came and I just said it. And it was something silly. It was just something really lighthearted. And she started laughing. And I started laughing, and we had this nice moment. And the reason I knew it was Christ was because neither of us had a very good sense of humor at this point in our lives. We were super intense intellectual people, but not super humorous. And so here we were laughing together. And I just thought, well, this was much more enjoyable than the fighting about parenting. So, in Paul's writings, when Paul was traveling around talking to the Thessalonians and the Corinthians, he said in numerous ways, he said, you all have the mind of Christ. What do you think he was saying? What does that mean, the mind of Christ? Just briefly. And what comes to you when you think of having the mind of Christ?
The intelligence which is God.
Okay, that intelligence is from God, right? It's not about the human mind figuring it all out. I spent actually a whole year, about 7 years ago, trying to take those words, figure it out of my vocabulary. Because I could hear myself, I have to figure this out. I decided to stop telling myself I'm going to figure it all out, because it's more about being receptive to that divine intelligence. That's great. The mind of Christ is always connected to that divine intelligence. Anything else? The mind of Christ? Gracious. Very gracious. Yes, there's a sense of grace that drives every action in a way. Yeah, good. Anything else?
A sense of higher mind, an upper mind?
Yes, a sense that there's a divine consciousness, a oneness of mind that's bigger than like a whole bunch of individual human opinions, all conflicting. Like with my sister, right? That she had her mind, I had my mind, and they were in conflict. But this sense of the Christ mind connects us. We may not have the same opinion. We may not agree on everything. In fact, and my sister knows I tell this story and we laugh about it now, but she never stopped giving me parenting advice, literally. Like I took my son to college in February and she called me up and said, I think you should do this, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it was fine advice. In that case, it didn't make sense, but often her advice is now very good. And I do sometimes take her advice, but I haven't reacted to it since. And it certainly doesn't provide conflict between us. And even when we disagree, there's no angst or tension or discomfort or lack of love. We just have different perspectives, and that's okay. And that to me is what the mind of Christ does. Is it says beyond our opinions that we refuse to be divided from each other. That beyond the way someone behaves, it sees into their heart, to who they are. That no matter how egregious and how awful the behavior, no matter how justified we feel in disliking or judging or criticizing or condemning someone, the mind of Christ looks deeper. And when we connect with that stillness, I think we see behind even the worst behavior. And it's challenging. I'm not saying I can do all this all the time with other people, but it looks deeper than the behavior. Because the intelligence comes directly from what God says, not from the way people behave. And that's what allows us to not feel like we're, what's this called? A Newton's cradle, I think. There's 5 balls hanging on a little contraption, and you lift one on one side and let it go, and it hits the 3 in the middle, and then the one on the other side swings out. Is that called Newton's cradle, I think, or something? But something, I forget the name, but it's this idea that it's constant reaction, right? Is it something else? Anyway, tell me after. I forget. But the point is, for me, that the mind of Christ allows us to get off of that pattern, that we're not living in constant reaction to other people, that we get our thoughts and they're unique and they're interesting, and sometimes they're funny, even if we don't think we have a sense of humor. And they change the conversation that we're having. So just one thought from Mary Baker Eddy on this. She said at one point that we should adopt the spirit of the Savior's ministry and abide in such a spiritual attitude as will draw men unto us. Mind demonstrates omnipresence and omnipotence, but mind revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. That it's in the stillness where we feel that Christ mind. And I don't think it requires us to leave the daily lives. It doesn't require us to cut off ties with other people. We don't have to go into the mountains or retreat to some monastery somewhere. That eternal stillness can just be in that brief pause throughout our day, in the middle of all that we have to do, to think about what it means to have the mind of Christ. Okay, so last topic, and then we'll have a few comments and questions. What about world events? What about when something happens in the news, or a politician does something that we don't like, or the people we wanted elected didn't get elected, and so now we're going to be frustrated for 4 years here in America, or whatever it might be. What allows us to focus on that sense of being and find stillness in, regardless of what's happening in the world, and even if it's something really despairing, like another shooting, or in America, or there was recently a shooting in the Netherlands. There was what happened in New Zealand. Whatever it might be that tries to bring us into despair. I think even worse sometimes is to breed apathy, that we don't know how to deal with these things, so we just kind of try to go about our lives and try not to think about it. But stillness, for me, is what allows us to be part of the solution for the world. And years ago, when I was 20, I heard a talk by a woman who lived in Germany during the time when the Berlin Wall was up. And it's significant that I was 20, because she said that she prayed for 10 years every single day for the wall to come down. So this was half of my lifetime at this point. And I couldn't imagine, how do you pray every day for 10 years without seeing results for something? So that was my question to her afterwards, because I was a little incredulous. The spell, right? I just was trying to think about this, and she said to me something I'll never forget. She said, "Laurie, the wall came down in a moment. It wasn't the work of a moment. It was the work of all those moments leading up to the wall coming down that changed consciousness, that changed the thought that was keeping that wall together. And then she said, how do you think you change consciousness? She said that for her, prayer was about getting really quiet and still and connecting with that sense of hope that somebody mentioned earlier, that was beyond what you see in front of you. And as she did that, she could feel the mental blocks that were holding that wall together shifting. She could feel the mental blockages breaking up in thought. And so she kept going because she could feel the thought changing. And she didn't say this, but it's almost like she wasn't concerned about when the wall would come down, as long as she could feel her thought moving. And she knew that that was moving thought in the world. And to me, what that says is that every single prayer, if it's truly mentally being on our knees and grappling with what's hard, with what looks like something intractable, with what looks impossible, with things that look like they have no solution, that as we grapple with that honestly, authentically, and we find a place where we can feel a sense of hope, that doing that for ourselves has an effect in the world. It shifts thought in the world as well. And it always starts with that. Every solution, every innovation starts with thought. My kids love the Tesla car. They keep wanting us to get a Tesla. You know, and I think about the Tesla, this electric car, that it started with an idea. Or the iPhones we all carry with us, right? It started with an idea. Sometimes ideas that people say, oh, that'll never work, right? And then eventually down the line, people say, oh, we always thought it that way. You know? So that thought evolves like that. But that it always begins in thought. And we can all influence thought. We all participate in kind of this canvas of thought, of consciousness that exists in the world. And whatever our thoughts are on any given day are participating in that conversation, that mental conversation that's happening. Ago, when I was in peace building, for children to draw what they thought peace looked like. So all these kids drew their pictures and they sent them in. And this was the winning picture. A child had drawn a rushing, roaring waterfall, spilling over rocks and kind of churned up at the bottom. And behind the waterfall, on a little rock ledge, the child had drawn a yellow canary bird. And they had pictured the canary as singing. And that was the image that spoke to this group who was holding the contest about what peace is. It wasn't a picture of serenity, of no noise, of no turbulence. It had the conflict, it had the challenges. But there was this little bird on this ledge singing. I don't know what that says to you, and I'm sure you'll hear your own ideas about it, but some of the things I love about it are that the canary's voice probably couldn't even be heard over the noise of the waterfall, but it didn't care. It was still singing, even though it was super tiny and the waterfall was enormous. And that's often how the problems in the world feel. Like we're this little tiny canary bird, and what use does our voice have? How can we possibly influence the waterfall of thoughts and of stuff that is going on in the world? And so I think so many of us just forget about it and just, go to, buy our expensive coffees and to go about our lives. And we do have to do those things. We have to get things done. But I think that as we don't turn away from the challenges of the world, as we don't just flow with the current of thought and agree, oh yeah, that person's just terrible. Oh yeah, that's just a problem. Oh, it's always just going to be that way. As we refuse to agree with that mentally, it starts to shift the mental blocks in the world that are holding together racism or injustice or inequality or poverty or oppression. It starts to chip away at those things and provide a solution for others to find health and healing as well. That no effort on our part ever goes wasted, because what's in our thought and consciousness is contributing to that larger mind, that larger sense of what goes on in the world. And as we kind of tune into that divine mind we talked about, that oneness of mind, it allows us to put our own opinions aside. It doesn't mean we don't have a perspective. It doesn't mean we don't vote. It doesn't mean we don't wish for our candidate to get in office or whatever. It doesn't mean we don't, go out and work for a campaign or something. But what I think it means to me is that even if what we want to see doesn't happen, we're still going to contribute to being part of seeing the peace, the qualities of that we want to see, that we look beyond the people to the qualities behind it. And then we stand firm and insist on those being present. And that mental activity contributes to the solution. And this is how Mary Baker Eddy says it, much better than me. She says, the best spiritual type of Christly method for uplifting human thought and imparting divine truth is stationary power, stillness, and strength. And when this spiritual ideal is made our own, it becomes the model for human action.
Could you read that again?
Yep. The best spiritual type of Christly method for uplifting human thought and imparting divine truth is stationary power, stillness, and strength. And when this spiritual ideal is made our own, it becomes the model for human action. That as we start with ourselves, it creates a new model for human action. It doesn't mean we'll all invent the Tesla, but we're contributing to the thought that allows for that idea to come forward. And that has power. And the power is in those moments of stillness. Not in being the loudest voice or the biggest person or having the most money, but in being still and connecting with those qualities that we talked about. So I'll leave you there for today, but let's just take a couple of minutes, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, your comments, anything you'd like to contribute or any questions you'd like to ask anybody. And also, if you're online, you can type them into the computer and I'll see them. So
my way of stillness is two things. That God saying to me, let me do the loving and let me do the thinking.
she said, for those of you online, she said that her way of stillness is two things. That God says, let me do the loving, right? And let me do the thinking. But I love it that because it really, I don't think that, Mary Baker Eddy writes in her book in the beginning, the time for thinkers has come, right? That we're all meant to be thinkers, but there's a trap with the intellect. That sometimes being really smart intellectually is like what I was thinking that one year, like I got to figure it out. I'm intelligent enough. I should be able to figure out this problem, right? But there's a point where the human mind has to quiet itself. It has to be quiet for healing to happen. It's not an activity of our mind. It's not something we do in our brain that allows healing to happen. It's only when we put that off with the divine thinking that inspiration comes that we're not thinking of, and that's where healing happens. Thank you for that idea. That's great. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
The last readings that you had, where are those found?
Yeah, the very last thing I read twice was from Retrospection and Introspection, page 93, Mary Baker Eddy's writings, yeah. And I can give other references after if you need them. Sure. Anything else? Any other comments or questions from anyone? You're all just feeling so still. It's okay. Yeah.
It's a profoundly feminine influence or power, isn't it? I mean, I think that's what drew me to, and my family to Mary Baker Eddy's, because it's not about the control and the dominance. of the acceptance and the love and the nurture, which is, largely feminine.
Oh, I can't say it as well as you did. That was beautiful, but I'll just repeat it, try to repeat. Yeah, that is largely the quality of the feminine, because it's about acceptance and love and nurturing as opposed to dominance and the other things you mentioned, that's what Mary Baker Eddy was offering. And I think, in Christian Science, we talk about God being masculine and feminine, male and female, father and mother. And again, that's not to conjure up an image of a God far away, but it's that the qualities of feminine and masculine that encompass this concept of divine power are also in every one of us, and that we value equally that feminine and masculine qualities, and that there is a feminine acceptance and nurturing that means we have to put off all that doing. The doing activity is important. I mean, we don't stop doing things and just sit still all day, right? That's not the message. But in the midst of all the things we have to do, to not devalue or overlook the qualities of how we're doing it. But one of my favorite hymns in the Christian Science Church is "Shepherds, Show Me How to Go." It's a poem written by Mary Baker Eddy, and it really struck me, and some of you probably had this insight, but the shepherd is showing us how, not where. And for about 10 years, I had that question, Father, I kept praying to God, what's my calling? What's my purpose? Where should I be? And I felt like I had these two roads that were going in opposite directions for 10 years, and I couldn't bring them together. I kept trying to bring them together, and it was not working. And I kept kind of being in both places. And that's what occurred to me. Every time I prayed about which direction, God, the answer was, it's not about which direction, it's how you're going, wherever you're going. I thought, no, I needed just a direction. But I took it seriously, and I did it. What happened is I just took whatever step was in front of me, and I focused on how am I doing what's in front of me. And even if it felt like the small, or whatever it might be, walking the dog, that I wanted to know how I could do that with Christliness, with love, with those qualities. And I think that is that sense of the feminine, that the qualities of our being are equally as important as what we do, maybe more so. And that's where stillness is found. Thank you for that. It's great. Yes?
But in the process of supporting and admiring the feminine, I looked at Jesus' example of feminine and the masculine. And what came to my thought right now is how he stood up to the Pharisees and refused to be bowed down by them to not heal on the Sabbath day.
Yeah.
Yet so many of his healings occurred on the Sabbath, but he was criticized for it.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, I'm doing God's work.
Yeah. Yeah. So this young man in the back was talking about, for those online, about the balance of the masculinity of Jesus as well, and how standing up to the Pharisees and still healing on the Sabbath day was an example of kind of that strength and that masculine strength. There's such a need, at least in America right now, and in Europe, I think as well, to sort of understand these qualities of masculine and feminine. This is a whole other talk, so we won't go there, but or should be. But I think there's a lot. I find there's a lot of questions about it. I get people calling me for healing that just are trying to understand what these qualities mean, and I think that it isn't about valuing one more than the other. It's not about valuing one over the other. It's about seeing the value of the masculine, the value of the feminine, and that there's so much goodness in those concepts and those qualities in each one of us. And then as we start with ourselves, this is kind of a theme today, that as we look to ourselves and our own thoughts about that, it changes how the world feels about it, that we can find that in ourselves. Okay, there's just one question online. I want to make sure. Oh, okay. It's a technical question, so I'll answer it later. All right. Anyway, anything else? Yes? Yeah?
I have to think about stationary power. I need some help.
That's great. She said, I want to think about stationary power. I need some help. I know. I love the concept of stationary power. What does that mean? I think that it's being still, right? And I think that it can mean lots of things. I'm sure you're going to get a great insight into it. And I hope you tell me what it is, because I'd love to know. For me, I think right now, stationary power is like a power that's rooted. like a tree, like an oak tree, right? It's so rooted. And I think about, I have this tree in my backyard it's a maple tree actually, that's probably 200 or 300 years old. It's huge. And I just think about how deep those roots go into the ground. Sometimes they try to grow into our well system, which is a problem, but and they're way out in the yard and stuff. And so anyway, they have these deep roots in the ground, and the tree is enormous. It has these gorgeous colors in the fall and branches that shade almost our entire house. And so I love that analogy for that sense of that, and then growing towards the light and able to branch out into the world. And so that there is that sense of rootedness in God. It's like the canary on the rock ledge. The canary wasn't flying. I don't know if I'm not sure the little kid thought about this, but I love that sense of the canary being on the rock, on that sturdy rock. And there's just one more analogy I'll share, and then we'll close. And if you have other things, I'll be happy to stay after. A couple of years ago, I was here in Colorado, and I was whitewater rafting for the first time. And a friend of mine was guiding. I can't remember what river. I should know. Browns Canyon, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, Browns. What is it? The Arkansas. I think it was the Arkansas. Anyway, so she was teaching me about the river and how to read the river. And she was telling us to look for the eddies in the river. And the eddies are the still places in the river. And they occur, and you probably all know this because you're all from Colorado, but anyway, for those online or whatever, they occur because there's a rock rooted in the bedrock of the river, and it sticks up above the water, and then just upstream from that rock is where the water kind of swirls, and you don't get pulled by the current. And so in a rafting sense, because you're navigating the rapids, and they can be turbulent and difficult, and you have to carefully paddle and navigate the rapids, and it can be hard work. That after you get through the rapids, you want to maybe, especially if there's a series of them, you want to look for the eddies so you can rest. Because if you put your oars down and you're in the eddy, the current won't pull your boat. You'll just sit there still, even if the river is super fast. And I love that analogy for kind of stationary power in a way too, that there's a rootedness and there's a stillness, and we're not flowing with kind of the current of popular thought or popular opinion, or just the current of like reactionary thinking, or even coming to conclusions that maybe really aren't conclusions about ourselves that we want to accept. That in that stillness, there's a stationary power, and it's rooted in something very deep, which is God. That's sort of an infinite understanding that all of us are learning a little more about each day. So anyway, I look forward to your own insights about that too. But I think about those eddies and those still places as keeping us from getting pulled with that current, and that's a stationary power. Okay. Thank you all for being a great audience. It was so nice to